With my co-host, the beautiful Patricia Kirkman, PK, all the way from sunny Tucson. Don't tell me what the temperature is there. I may just die.
No, it's okay. It's a little cool right now. It's like 71, 72.
Oh, my God. Okay.
But no sunshine. Not much sunshine.
Oh, gee, that's a shame.
Makes a difference.
My heart breaks for you in Tucson. We've been freezing to death here. We really have.
Poor
It's been
babies.
terrible. Yes, I know. It's going to end, though, I think, after this weekend. If we all survive this weekend, we will go on to warmer temperatures.
God, I hope so. Watching the ice, the firemen trying to put out a fire, and it's nothing but ice.
Yeah, it's
out of the
terrible.
hoses, and they're dripping. I go, okay. It feels pretty good here today.
It sure does. You're in the right place. That's where you are. So we've got a great show tonight because we're talking about cannabis and spirituality with Stephen Gray. We're going to bring him on in a little while. And we're also going to be talking to Ezra Parzybuck, who is a marijuana consultant, a cannabis consultant here in Massachusetts. And he's going to help us get some clarity on what's going on with these crazy laws. So we'll bring Ezra on in a minute, but first we got to check in with you. It's a new year. What's going on for us numerologically?
Well, the new year is all about partnerships, teamwork, being cognizant of everybody else's feelings. All of us are going to walk around with this, oh, woe is me kind of a feeling because that sensitivity button's pushed on everybody. But the personal year, or excuse me, the universal month this year is a 3, so it's all about good communications and creativity and being able to go forward and look at all these neat things. So if we tie that up with a partnership, and by the way, partnership is the key throughout the year. Partners coming and partners going. So you're going to read about a lot of marriages coming up in engagements. In fact, Paris Hilton got engaged today. Big deal.
Oh my God.
And a 20-carat ring. Okay.
Oh, of course.
So the proper hand up. But anyway, marriages and divorces are going to be thing because partnerships, as I said, they're coming and they're going. So people will tend to be a little overly sensitive, which can also make them insensitive. So if we kind of play really pretty with each other and try to make sure everybody gets their piece of the pie, help serve them, make life better, it'll be better for all of us.
That sounds terrific. Well, okay, so now we know what the theme is, which is communication. Now, we've got a lot of really good paranormal stories on our Facebook page, so be sure to visit us there at Supernatural Girls with a Z. Give us a like, follow us. You'll be sure to be in touch with all the things that we've got coming up. As you know, PK, I got an inside call today from one of my people about the UFO stuff. Now, we're not going to talk about it right now, but we are going to talk about it next week. So be sure to, again, keep tuning into our Facebook page. Go to our website, supernaturalgirls.com, to sign up for our newsletter, The Fringe Files. We're going to have lots of new information coming out. Also about how to form your own spirit team. We have got the best stuff coming up, always the best guests on our show, and, of course, the best audience. So we're going to jump right in tonight. We are just jumping in, and we're going to introduce you to Ezra Parzybuck. Again, he is a cannabis consultant here in Massachusetts. Ezra, welcome to the show.
Hi, Patricia. And Patricia, thanks for having me.
Great to have you here.
Great.
Lucky to have you this evening to dispel some of this confusion so many of us are going through.
It's a mess. Now, I know we were talking off the air, PK and I, and all of you, about the fact that it has become legal for recreational use in Massachusetts. It's been legal for medical use now for what, 2 years? Has it been?
Since 2012.
2012?
Yes.
Wow.
Though,
but there were no dispensaries. So
right. We didn't have dispensaries for the 3rd year after legalization. It was a very, very slow rollout, and it still is. In fact, there should be 35 full open dispensaries, one for each county, and I believe there's only 12 that have gotten open. So it's just been a very slow process.
It seems that way, and it seems like the regulations are very, very strict, and also that people don't know what really is going on with the recreational aspect that became legal this year. So we were hoping you could enlighten our audience, because we've had a lot of questions from people and wanted to know when we were going to have you back to talk about this very subject. So if you can, enlighten us as best you can with what's happening.
I'll see what I can do. So yes, the medical law, so medical marijuana passed in 2012, a lot more strict. You had to be a patient, you had to get registered by a doctor, and it was partly why the recreational law passed is because the rollout was so slow, and it was rolled out by the Department of Public Health, which for decades has been anti-marijuana. So they didn't really have much incentive to just make it roll out as fast as they could, and the code was very stringent. Now, as far as recreational, they've put in a timeline so that this doesn't happen. So they are actually moving forward a little faster, even though we passed it, last year. And so when is it going to happen? It's not like January 1st hit, 2 days ago, and we think, okay, great, we'll just go to a shop and buy. Excuse me. But the way it works is that the regulations will be presented by March 1st, so that everyone knows all the hoops they have to jump through in order to open a shop, open a cafe, start their own cultivation site, start a delivery service. There's all kinds of possible businesses that can be created. Then on April 1st, they'll be accepting applications for these businesses. And I believe there's 5 classes of business. So there's the cafe, the cultivation, the retail, so those are the 3 main ones. And then there's sort of different subcategories, like, are you a micro business? Are you going to be a big business? Are you more ancillary?
So there's a lot of opportunities for investors and business people here, which is interesting. But what about just the average person? I mean, they don't know what's legal and what isn't. And as we discussed before, some people, at least in Connecticut, are being arrested even though they shouldn't be getting arrested.
That's right. It's a very bizarre legal area that's actually going to go forward for possible years. So right now, if you're over 21 in the state of Massachusetts, you can possess cannabis up to 1 ounce. Actually, it might be 2 ounces now. If you're a medical patient, you can possess 10 ounces. You can grow it in your home. You can grow up to 12 plants per household. You can give it away to friends, and actually you can procure it. So the idea is that you can still purchase it if you're an adult, but it's illegal to sell it. So that's a weird gray area. But now you have, so you have people who, you could be a person who's grows your own marijuana. Maybe you make some brownies. You process it, you make some brownies, you're traveling to your friend's house for a party, and everything's completely legal. You get pulled over by the police. If he smells pot brownies, and he sees that you have 25 brownies, he could say, well, those are packaged for individual sale, or you could sell those, and so I'm going to arrest you for intent to sell.
Oh my God, that's just so counterproductive to what all of this is about.
Yeah, so I've been working with lawyers. One of the things I do is consult with lawyers and defendants in these cases, and it is very crazy because some of them are just truly legitimate patients. They have a legal amount in their possession, but either the police, and I don't want to disparage anybody, I think everybody's sort of doing the best they can. Occasionally you have police who are they're old school, they see marijuana and they just think it's bad, and so they try and throw the book at the people. I've had cases too where a guy got caught with 1 joint and they go back to his house and search his whole house. That is a major violation. So yeah. Education needs to happen, and also, so even so when they the idea is this year, July 1st, the first shops will open for people over 21. But even then, you could buy cannabis from a shop and then be driving down the road, and if you get pulled over, and if the cop thinks you intend to sell that, if you try to make your own money selling it, you could get arrested and go to jail for it, because we still have laws on the books against selling if you don't have a license to sell marijuana. So it's a very confusing law. Basically, the state is trying to create a situation where there's so many hoops to jump through so that it deters people from trying to do an underground business, and also incentivizes them on some level to say, all right, well, we're presenting you with the hoops, so just jump through them and then we won't arrest you.
And with you see why I wanted Ezra on the show, PK? This is the reason.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
To their credit, they are also trying to do a few things that many people in the industry are worried about. One is this idea of big marijuana. So it's these huge corporations that have tons of funding, and they can go in and they send their team of lawyers in, and they don't have any problem jumping through all these hoops. Double security systems, and a camera has to be at every single angle in your establishment, and you have to track your marijuana via video from the point it's planted as a seed all the way till it arrives at the customer. So in order to prevent the big guys from getting all the money, they are creating a craft marijuana cooperative and micro business categories so that you can have a smaller business. But still, you have to have dual security teams, and you have to have
good lawyers.
Good lawyers, and if you can't get it,
a misstep, you could be in big trouble. Well, exactly. I wanted to just, Ezra, please give people your website so they can find you. If they have questions, they can contact you directly. What is your website?
It is now EzraHelps.com. So you can just email me, Ezra@EzraHelps.com. You can find me online. I have tons of information for patients if people are interested in that, blog posts. So EzraHelps.com is the easiest way to find me.
Okay, we're going to have you back on when your book is out, Ezra.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us to help clarify this mishigosh that's going on.
Sure. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Take care and have a great night.
Thank you, Ezra.
Good night,
Stay
Ezra.
warm.
Yeah, definitely stay warm.
Oh, my goodness. So let's now move to spirituality and cannabis, because that is really the topic for tonight's show. And this is something that has not really been addressed except by our amazing guest tonight, Stephen Gray, who wrote this book, Cannabis and Spirituality. It is a very rich book. It is well done. He has many
excellent book.
Really,
the
many
bookends here.
People in this book have contributed to it. So let me just tell you a little bit about Stephen, because he is a teacher and writer on spiritual subjects and sacramental medicines. He has worked extensively with Tibetan Buddhism, the Native American Church, and with entheogenic medicines. He's also the author of another book, Returning to Sacred World, the spiritual toolkit for the emerging reality. He's also a conference and workshop organizer, leader, and speaker, as well as a part-time photographer. What does this guy not do? Okay. Well, let's get him on the show. Stephen, welcome to Supernatural Girls.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect.
Can hear you perfectly.
I unmuted my mic.
Oh, you did it yourself.
Yay!
Good job.
All by myself, yeah.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit about how you got into the spiritual side of working with cannabis. What attracted you to this topic?
Okay, well, I guess I have to go right back to the late 1960s for that, because I'll try to keep this short. It's not my nature to do that, but the shortest version I can make it is that there was an explosion of interest in both spirituality and psychedelics in the late 1960s in North America and other places, and cannabis was sort of dragged along into that in a way. A whole new generation of people, this baby boom generation demographic, suddenly out of nowhere, more or less, started to smoke cannabis as well. And so I was interested in all of that. I was interested in the spiritual side of it. Much of the spirituality was focused toward Asia, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, for example. And the use of psychedelics, LSD being the main one at that that time, but certainly not the only one, was associated with that spirituality for a lot of people, certainly not for everybody, but I became very interested in that and began to see that there was a whole other dimension to life that far exceeded what most people had experienced or even heard about, that could be opened up potentially through the use of psychedelics. And then what happened was there was I guess you'd call it a meme going around in what we called the counterculture at the time. This group of people now often referred to as hippies, which was okay. You've had an opening of some kind or another, and now what are you going to do with it? You can't just take LSD for the rest of your life every day, unless your name is Timothy Leary, but that's another story. Didn't necessarily help in that regard. Anyway, more seriously, the idea or the meme that came along at that time was you need a daily path of some kind or another. So I got involved with that. For me, that became Tibetan Buddhism. That went on for quite a while until Terence McKenna. Do you guys know who Terence McKenna is?
So tell us who Terence McKenna is.
Okay, well, he could have a whole interview in a whole hour just to talk about him. But he was the number one philosopher spokesperson for psychedelics starting in about the 1980s and influenced a lot of people. He passed away, I think, in 2000, but you can find his YouTube videos all over the place. Very interesting guy. And he had gone to South America and discovered that people had been using substances like ayahuasca for thousands of years, but always, never recreationally, or, maybe there was the odd rogue, but basically they always used them either ceremonially or for healing purposes. That's what a shaman is, a healer. And so he kind of put those two together for me, because the Tibetan Buddhist community that I was involved with didn't have anything to do with psychedelics and didn't encourage them. But I always remembered there was this spiritual potential with those substances. So that's how I got back into it again. And then that led to me eventually becoming connected to a conference up here that I've been co-organizing for 7 years called the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. And like I said, I'm trying to keep it short, but it doesn't usually work.
It's a long journey with this, it sounds like, which is good.
I'm leading up to the sort of the key moment, so to speak, the climax of the story which was
waiting to hear it. Yes.
One of the people that we had at the conference is Kathleen Harrison, who's a remarkable person. She was actually married to this Terence McKenna for 15 years, but she's a world-class ethnobotanist, teacher, and a great elder spokesperson for the psychedelics. And she and I were having a conversation, because I'm the one, still am the one who often finds the speakers for the conference. So she and I were talking. I told her that I thought cannabis, while it was becoming more and more popular and spreading across the cultures, there was this one side of it that I had found out about through reading and so on, which was that it had an ancient history as a spiritual medicine, really ancient, 10,000 years at least. That's just what we know. But that it wasn't getting that attention as it burgeoned in, recreational and medical uses, et cetera, et cetera. I said that I didn't think I had a whole book in myself to write. And she said to me, well, if you put that together as a project, I would promise to contribute a chapter to it. And she's a very wise person and a beautiful writer, and that was the trigger for me. That was 5 years ago. So then I ended up gathering a total, counting me, of 18 contributors to the book. Oh. And to answer a question that you haven't specifically asked yet, the mission of the book is to redress that issue, that cannabis, when used carefully, when used wisely, respectfully, responsibly, with knowledge about how to use it, because we consider it an advanced spiritual medicine, not, it's not like you just take a pill and, the world opens up necessarily. There are ways to use it, and so that's what the purpose of the book is.
Well, we need this.
Fabulous.
It's so necessary, I think, with everybody having this to deal with from the legal side, the medical side, the recreational side. This has been the missing piece. Now, here's an interesting question from our chat room for you, Graham. This gentleman says, why did indigenous tribes even consider to use these drugs as part of their ceremonies? Like, how did they know to use it?
Oh, well, gee, that's a tough question. I think ethnobotanists would be able to answer that one pretty well oftentimes. My understanding, and I think this is, close enough to the truth to be useful, is that before we had grocery stores, which was for most of our history until extremely recently, you needed to know the uses of every plant in your neighborhood. You needed to know if it could be used for a building material, if it could be used for clothing, for medicine, to eat it. And they weren't necessarily looking for plants that would have a spiritual opening potential, but if they ate those plants, such as mushrooms or different things like that, they would certainly find out. And cannabis certainly sits into that category because it's been around for, well, the family from which it comes has been around for at least 30 million years on the planet.
Wow, incredible.
And so, if you're in China, where they think it may have originated from, northeastern China perhaps, and you see this plant around, you're going to find out that what you can do with it. And if you were to make it into a tea or, something like that, you'd certainly find out what it can do, right? So that's one part of the answer. The other sort of grossly oversimplified version of the answer to your question about, or that person's question about, why would indigenous people, use these plants is really difficult to answer. And, I don't think anyone now would know for sure, but it seems to me, I've read a fair amount of anthropological literature and so on, that most people's there was a, I don't know how to put this exactly, really simply, the wall, so to speak, between the spirit world and the material world was pretty thin for a lot of cultures, a lot of communities throughout history. And so even without the use of medicinal plants or whatever, people were often in contact with spirits, of one kind or another, whether you want to call that God or guardian angels, or in some cases even demonic energies even, So when people found out that they could open those doors wider with the use of certain specific plants, they would do that. Here's perhaps a summing up of that answer. I think I actually quoted this fellow in my first book who was a shaman from Peru, and he was at a conference, and he said, we don't have a problem with Western science in one sense, like we appreciate the things that Western science has learned about medical issues, but it's only half of the answer. The other half is spirit. That when you use a plant for medicinal purposes or any purposes, healing purposes, you ideally, and this is what I think indigenous people would say all over the world, you connect with the spirit of that plant so that you bring that in. And ayahuasca,
exactly.
You mentioned ayahuasca before we started the conversation on air here. The well-trained ayahuasqueros, the shamans or whatever you want to call them, they know that they're going to be calling on the spirit or spirits to help with the work that they're doing. That's what those icaros are about, for example. I've been told by a shaman in South America, an ayahuasca shaman, that the songs are actual beings, in a sense, that you learn those songs by contacting spirit, and they teach them to you, and then when you're doing your work in the ceremony, a song will come in and, in a sense, say, I'm the song for this situation now. Right, and they have immense power that way. So I'm getting perhaps a little off the cannabis topic here, but
no, but that's okay, because I think what you're addressing is what our audience wants to hear, which is how do you connect with the plant spirit? How do you connect, with this medicine for the soul, basically, and then this where does it take you next? I mean, this is a very fascinating topic for everybody in our audience tonight. Now, here's another question. This is from Bluebird, who wants to know, I'd like to know if any of these plants are protected by local governments in certain parts of the world.
Well, we're definitely getting beyond just the cannabis issue here. So maybe I'll just briefly say that I think that within maybe 20 years or so, cannabis is going to be legal in a great number of jurisdictions. Right now, Uruguay has made it legal for their own citizens. Portugal has decriminalized all psychedelics, all drugs, essentially. Europe is in various stages of moving toward this. Canada is about to have across-the-board federally approved legalization for all uses of marijuana for adults. The United States, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, has at least 6 states with recreational legal marijuana, and 30, I believe it is, with medical marijuana legalized. So it's changing rapidly, and so that I think we can be optimistic about, because it's going to, what people are going to find out is it's not nearly the big deal that everyone was, in positions of conservative authority, so to speak, were concerned about. It'll just be kind of, a normal thing after a while. Holland, for example, has had de facto legalization of cannabis, not actual legalization because they're part of the EU and it's not allowed, the European Union, but they have these, quote unquote coffee shops, and they've had them for 40 or more years, and so it's not stigmatized there essentially, and it's easily accessible. And the percentage of the population that uses cannabis is significantly lower than it has been all these years in Canada and the United States, where it's been illegal, right? So my take on that is that once the novelty is past, once the stigma is out of the way, and it's been around for a while, it'll kind of settle. Things will settle down. Laws will relax a little more. People will be able to decide for themselves, and a lot of people will just go, well, okay, it's not the plant for me. I'm not interested. So that's cannabis. Psilocybin mushrooms, except for, again, places like Portugal where they've decriminalized all drugs, I don't believe I know of any jurisdictions where that is legal now. Ayahuasca is a really interesting one because there are churches that stem from Brazil. There are at least 3 of them. The best known is called the Santo Daime religion, and they have many, many adherents, and they've been spreading around the world, and they've been gaining levels of legal recognition. They won a Supreme Court decision in Oregon, for example, where a very particular church has been given permission to legally have their ceremonies with ayahuasca. They call it the daime. They call the medicine the daime. And there's moves toward that in Canada. I don't specifically know, but there are jurisdictions in Europe, I think, that are kind of close to that at this point. Then there's the peyote medicine.
Yes, that's another one. Well, we're going to get to all of the spiritual side of this and how people can do this, how they can, if this is something for them, then, and again, like you said, for some people this is not a good thing, but there are people who this will really work for and connect to a spiritual soul path like none other. So we're going to get to all of that. We're going to take a very short commercial break, and we will be right back. So listen, everybody, this is a great show. You're going to learn a lot from Stephen Gray. He's the author of the book, Cannabis and Spirituality. He's actually the editor, but he also has his own chapter in here that he wrote. So that's a beautiful book. So we're going to come back and just unwrap all of this beautiful information. You are listening to Supernatural Girls Radio, and we will be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to Supernatural Girls Radio. I'm your host, Patricia Baker. I'm here with my lovely co-host from Tucson, PK. You can visit PK online at patriciakirkman.com. If you want to see what's coming up for you in 2018, she is the woman to speak with. So go to patriciakirkman.com. So tonight, we are having a very interesting discussion with a lot of information, and it's about cannabis and spirituality. And now we're going to go more into spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening. How does that happen with cannabis, Stephen? Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. So I think the first thing that I want to say to lay the ground for that is, I wouldn't say that I haven't reached the end of the line, so to speak, but I have been working with spiritual practice for many, many years, and meditation and so on, as well as various psychedelics or entheogens, as people prefer to call them. And I've certainly read a lot as well. My sense of what spiritual awakening is that there is an unconditioned reality that has nothing to do with belief about what is true or not true, or real or not real, or good or bad.
Stephen, we're having a little bit of trouble. Stephen, if you could just hang on for a second. We're having a little problem technically. I don't know if your internet connection is overloaded, but let's see if we can maybe start over, because you broke up through that explanation of spiritual awakening. So let's try this again and see if we can hear what you had to say.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I felt like that I should start with my understanding of what spiritual awakening is. And that comes from a lot of study and practice. And my understanding is that there is something that you could call unconditioned or unconditional reality that every human being is capable of, in a sense, falling into or relaxing into. It's not something that you create, in a sense. It's something that you remove obstacles to. And that's what the word Buddha actually means. Buddha means awake. And the Buddhist teachings say that everybody has Buddha nature. Okay, so that's the kind of the ground, and the reason that people are not what you might call awake or enlightened is because we create a whole bunch of obstacles for ourselves through the stories that we tell ourselves, the beliefs and concepts that we ship on from the people around us as we're growing up, and develop into our own narrative about who we are, what's real, what's not real, and so on, right? What's true, untrue.
Yes, that happens to each of us, right?
Yeah, but that's what you might call a fictional. That's the Buddhist teachings call it an illusion of the separate self that's disconnected from from everything. That's what they mean when they talk about oneness. That when you are able to let go, surrender, release these boundaries and walls and bonds that we kind of place around ourselves, then you start to discover that you actually are more, you gradually usually discover that you're connected to everything in that sense, and that at the root of that is an unconditioned, unambiguous sense of peace. That's what the word peace actually means, is that you can just settle down into this place that's real. And Buddhist teachings also say that enlightenment, a synonym for that is awakened heart. So your heart wakes up with that too, and you develop unconditional compassion or unconditioned compassion. So with that as a kind of a ground, the question is then, well, how can cannabis help with that, right? So
yes.
The starting point is to describe it as an amplifier, what you might call a non-specific amplifier. So you might say it's a gift of amplified, sharper, vaster energy, in a sense, that if you do it well, and we can talk about that, I think we should talk about that as we go forward here.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, if you use it properly, if you understand the principle of what you're doing, that can deepen and expand whatever your intention is. So that's another issue that we should probably talk about as we go along too, is that if your intention is either unconscious or consciously just to escape, cannabis can amplify that kind of intention as well. However, if your intention is to wake up, to heal, then it can open you up in that way. It can deepen your experience. So I think an important thing to point out, well, for those who are interested at least, is how that works biochemically. It's referred to as the pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics means the action of a drug or substance as it enters the body, how it's processed in the body, and how it leaves the body. So one of the chapters in the book is by Joan Bellow, who has a very interesting description of how that works. And she says that when you first smoke it or vaporize it, edible oral ingestion being a different case altogether, because it can take up to 2 hours to reach full effects when you take it orally. But if you smoke or vaporize cannabis, the effects are, to all intents and purposes, immediate, within seconds or a minute or two or whatever. And so when you do that, your heart speeds up somewhat. There's an increase in heart rate. That's well known and well recorded. And a subsequent pumping of fresh, rich, freshly oxygenated blood throughout the organism, and a concomitant relaxing of the skeletal or oppositional muscles. That's Joan Bellow's phrase for it, skeletal oppositional muscles. So the whole organism becomes more highly charged. If you're paying attention to it, as everybody who has ever been around cannabis, either for themselves or other people, knows, you can distract yourself and you can just busy your mind. You can have things going on all the time. But if you more or less kind of sit down, shut up, and pay attention, which is a phrase from Terence McKenna, who I mentioned earlier, then you can see that it can potentially, it has a lot to do with getting out of your head. Right? So if you can, and this is a basic spiritual principle anyway, Buddhism and other traditions talk about getting out of your own way, letting go of this narrative that I mentioned a few moments ago of thoughts constantly coming through. In fact, Buddhist teachings say that our thoughts are the primary kind of strategy or tactic that we use to create and preserve this fortress, this wall that we create around ourselves, so that we can maintain this seemingly comforting illusion of this separate self. So cannabis can help dissolve that.
The heart wall.
The walls, the hardness, the bonds, et cetera, but again, it needs to be channeled that way. So if you understand or accept this principle of the non-specific amplifier, then the next question for me is, how do you apply that? So I mentioned the sit down, shut up, and pay attention idea. That's essentially that's a synonym for meditating, really. And when I say meditating, I don't mean contemplating. I mean what Buddhist teachings and others would refer to as meditation, which is the simplest version is you just sit. You try to sit up straight so that your energy moves easily, what some people might call the Kundalini energy or whatever. And
right.
You're not going to tire as fast as you would if you're slouching over or whatever, and you just pay attention. So in the way meditation was taught to me, you use the breath as the anchor back into reality, because it's part of the autonomic nervous system. You don't think about your breath most of the time, right? And
right.
So if you pay attention to it in a light way, not over hyper focused, but just it brings you back into the full presence of this moment. And then inevitably thoughts come up. You're off in Never Never Land or whatever, thinking about tomorrow, yesterday, or whatever. And then when you recognize that, you just kind of let it go and come back to being present. Well,
now, let me just interrupt for a second, because I know what our audience is thinking about here. And so do you do your meditation on the heels of taking marijuana? I mean, I'm taking cannabis. Is that how you do this, or do you use it after your meditation? What are the mechanics of it? That's what they want to know.
Well, one answer to that question is that it's, as is said a few times in the book, it's the people's plant. So it's very amenable and gracious to experimenting with. So there's lots of different ways to work with the plant that way. I just wanted to say about meditation is that the idea is that as much as possible we open a gap in the ongoing thinking mind, right? And then we gradually, hopefully, surrender or relax into the unconditioned awakened state. and in degrees. And so what cannabis, being a non-specific amplifier, can actually heighten and deepen that process. Okay, so yes, there's lots of different ways to do it. For example, you might meditate for a while first, just to calm yourself down. And it's not just meditation. This is just kind of, I like to think of this simple kind of follow the breath kind of meditation as the sort of the purest way of working with it, because everybody has so much of an issue with the thinking mind that if we can simplify the container, you might say, that we're in, and remove distractions and just sit down, shut up, and pay attention, then we can really find out what this medicine can do when you get out of your own way. So you might meditate for a while first. You might do some other calming practices, yoga, tai chi, whatever. That's one way you could do it. And you might, as Kathleen Harrison in her chapter makes a point of saying, you might treat it with great respect. And if you do that, you're more likely to receive benefit from the plant. If you treat it, even though you might not have had experience with it as a spirit or anything like that, if you think maybe, just kind of like fake it till you make it kind of approach. It's like, what if there is a spirit behind this plant? Because as Kathleen Harrison says, indigenous people that she's known, she's a world-renowned in certain circles ethnobotanist, and has spent much time with indigenous people, and those people would say things like, there's a mother of every plant species. It's like the overseeing spirit, in a sense, of that plant species, and it's possible to contact that spirit. And if we had time, I could tell you some stories about people who say they have contacted the spirit of cannabis in that regard.
And can you give us one of those stories? What is that like? I mean, when they have that experience of reaching out that way, and they actually make contact.
Okay, I'll tell you my favorite one then. He was a leader of a spiritual community that worked with ayahuasca in Brazil, and they were way out in the jungle. And this was back in the 70s, I believe, and he was not familiar with cannabis. It wasn't around there. But this community was starting to get known, and sometimes people would just show up, and some young hippie guy arrived at his encampment and had some pot with him and felt kind of embarrassed about it. So he went to the leader guy and said, I've got this stuff with me. I'm not sure what I should do with it. I don't want to be disrespectful. And the leader said, well, give it to me and I'll find out for myself. So he went and had a little private solo ceremony with it. And he said that he had a vision, and the vision was that he found himself in a garden, and there was a woman tending the garden, and she saw him there, and she turned to him and said, I'm paraphrasing, of course, she said to him, you're in my garden. This is my garden, and that plant that you smoked, that's my plant, and it's here in my garden. And if you choose to, in your position of responsibility, what you could do is help people understand that this is actually a spiritual medicine, and that a lot of people don't understand that and misuse it, and it actually can be harmful in their lives if they misuse it. So it needs to be returned to its proper role, which is as a sacred medicine that belongs to the spirit, in a sense. And so because this community that he was involved in was a syncretic religion that included indigenous components as well as Christian elements, he dubbed her Santa Maria, Saint Mary. And so they actually call cannabis Santa Maria now. So they actually call it by the name of a saint.
That's
right?
Fascinating. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a great story. Yeah,
so there is that. So then coming back to the practice element, if I may, the simplest way to meet cannabis, and in a sense the most difficult, because it is an advanced spiritual medicine. It is raising the stakes. It's an amplifier, and so it's actually a challenge to do that. It's like meditation plus or something, in a sense. It's the same principle, it's the same trajectory, it's the same practice, but it can be more challenging because it actually wants to dissolve this illusory, structure that you've built, and soften you up that way. But if you can do that, then there's much reward that can come of it. So simply sitting down for part of the time, at least, that you work with cannabis and doing some kind of simple meditation can be very, very useful, I think. But it can also help with a variety of other, what you might call more form-based practices like yoga, Tai Chi, and some others. I just hope that people will let go of their dogma, like, oh, no, we can't mix those, There's people are like that, like, oh, no, God, my God, you can't corrupt Tai Chi by having cannabis or a drug involved. But if you just treat it as a spirit, as a respectful sacred plant, and think of it as a neutral substance, a non-specific amplifier, it can deepen your practice if you can do it with some kind of channeled focus, intention, and discipline in that regard. Okay.
Well, let me ask you a question, Stephen. Because there are, as you know, a lot of people now, you mentioned 30 states that have it as legal for medical use. Now, what I'm thinking is there's absolutely no reason why people who are using it to alleviate pain or seizures or whatever the issue is that they're using this for, they can also incorporate this spiritual element to their use. So they can also, if they so choose, take it beyond the medical use into when they're administering it in whatever form. They can also set their intent. They can also be open to this spiritual awakening, right?
Of course, yeah. I think an important point about that, and it's a difficult one, because if you're using cannabis for medicinal reasons, you may have to be using it not just daily, but several times a day. So, nobody should be, chastised or questioned about that kind of use. However, what a number of the contributors to the book all feel or believe from their experience is that if you can use it less frequently, it's going to likely be more effective as a spiritual medicine in terms of being able to go deeper with it, because there's a tolerance effect that most people experience when you use it daily, and and so the sharpness and the depth of it can be missing in that way. It's a bit tricky, in that regard, because I know people personally who are not using it for what you might narrowly define as medicinal use, but do it every day. And I can't say that there's some, as I say, personal friends that use it that way, and they're very effective in their lives. They're not slouches. They're not, falling into the couch, eating pizza, drinking beer, and watching television. They're compassionate, intelligent, active human beings. So that's one thing that cannabis can do for some people is. Okay, so one thing I didn't talk about with the pharmacokinetic function is that it tends to balance. Joan Bellow talks a little bit about this as well in the book, but also other people have talked about it. It tends to balance the blood flow to both brain hemispheres and generate a condition of homeostatic balance. Dr. Robert Melamede calls it a homeostatic regulator of cells and society, but that's another issue. And so it can just take the edge off a little for some people if they're using it right, if they're using it like they're not getting blasted, right? We're talking about maybe having 1 or 2 puffs early in the day, and then they go on about their day, and then maybe they have a top up in the afternoon and the evening. I'm leery about I don't want to encourage people to do that in general, because it's so easy to become dependent, what people would call addicted to this plant, because it's so seductive, and that's part of the kind of like almost, what do you call it, almost like a catch-22, that, you might have these beautiful experiences with it. I have frequent beautiful experiences with this plant, and, who wouldn't want to go back to a beautiful experience, It enhances your appreciation of many things, music, the munchies, food, and
right.
Visual acuity is enhanced. You look at a painting and you go, wow, I never saw the things in that painting that I'm seeing right now. It can induce great levels of appreciation, and that's why I wanted to mention the biochemical function, because you could say that the chemical reason for that is that it opens up these channels. It sends a fresh oxygenated blood throughout the system, right? So
yes,
it is very possible. Yeah, but it's very possible to be seduced by that and want to keep going back to it all the time. And that can have not only diminishing returns, but it can also lead to a pattern of what you might call addiction or dependence. And that's not necessarily healthy. Again, I just want to say, though, that some people are able to manage that in a healthy way on a daily basis, and it just kind of settles them down into a groove, and so that's up to individuals. It's the people's plant. I just think people should be aware that it's very easy to get seduced, especially it seems younger people and adolescents and early adults oftentimes can get seduced into using it that way. Kathleen Harrison, I really recommend people looking at her chapter in the book because she's very clear on that. She's got about a page and a half in her chapter where she talks about how some people don't want to come back out of that space into what she called the daylight world of responsibility and relationship, and they become more wedded to the plant than they are wedded to their relationships in their life. That can be a problem, and it can be a chronic problem. Some people, you probably know yourself, have fallen into that pattern for decades.
Sure,
right?
Because people have done it with alcohol, where alcohol becomes bigger than them. So, with any type of drug like cannabis, and that can become bigger than them. And so it doesn't have a reasonable space in their lives. It becomes just an overwhelming issue rather than it has its own space. So, this is a wonderful explanation of how to go about this, of how to work with this responsibly. If you do know that you have addiction problems, this may not be for you. So you have to know something about yourself when it comes to substances.
Right.
And you have to be willing to say, no, this isn't for me, and that's it, if that is the truth. So you've got to find that truth about yourself first before you take any steps towards this, whether it's legal or not. I mean, you still have to know yourself well enough to do this responsibly. And you did say that, except we're going to take the medical stuff and put it aside, and just say, if you're doing this for spiritual purposes, the recommendation is not to do this every day, right?
Yeah, again, without being hard and fast about it, because if I ask my friend that I was referring to one person in particular a few moments ago, the way she uses it daily, she would probably disagree with me because she gets a lot done. She's an open-hearted person. I'm not aware, I could be naive in certain situations, but I'm not aware of any downsides for her using it that way. And again, but I want to be careful about that with your listeners because that's not necessarily the case for everybody by any means. This is a person who's very active in life. She's holding down 3 jobs. She's one of the co-organizers of our conference. She's a cannabis ceremony leader, and she also leads cacao ceremonies, and she does private work with people using other psychedelics. She's what you might call a fairly well-processed human being, and she knows how to use her medicines and channel them. So that's something, again, another way of talking about effective, skillful use of cannabis is to talk about channeling that amplified energy.
Right, with proper intent and everything else. So we're going to get back to talking about more of this. We've got more questions from our chat room participants. Thank you so much, guys and gals, for sending those over. We're going to try to get to them in the next segment. And in the meantime, we're going to take a short commercial break, and we will be right back. This is Supernatural Girls Radio. Welcome back, everyone, to Supernatural Girls Radio. I'm your host, Patricia Baker, here on January 3rd, 2018. I'm here with my co-host, Patricia Kirkman, PK, all the way from sunny Tucson, and we are so jealous because it's in the 70s there, while we are in single digits in New England. But anyways, we are talking to a great guest tonight, Stephen Gray. He is the author of a new book, Cannabis and Spirituality. And we're learning, all about how to work with this plant, this sacred plant, this sacrament, to reach enlightenment, to take away the matrix that we've been hooked into for however many years, and finally get some freedom here. So here's a question that came up for you, Stephen, and it's from Rohan Lewis, who's asking, hello, Stephen, can you please explain what parts of the brain these hallucinogens are opening up to connect us to a spiritual connection?
Okay, well, I need to start with a disclaimer that I'm not a scientist, and I've only made a cursory or casual study of that per se. First of all, with cannabis, we have something in our bodies called the endocannabinoid system, endo meaning interior or something like that, okay? It's extensive. Some researchers have said it's the most prevalent receptor system in the human organism. Cannabis itself is an exogenous or exocannabis or cannabinoid, so it's taken into the body and it meets these ready receptors, right? So our system is very simpatico with cannabis. These ready receptors are all over in the brain, in the nervous system, and so on and so on. There's no toxicity to this plant. There's a term called LD50. Lethal dose 50. It's a medical term, and it means the dosage at which 50% of the people taking that particular drug will die, right? Alcohol has a very definite LD50 of somewhere around 32 ounces in a certain period of time. Many people die from pharmaceutical drugs taken legally just for the same reason.
That's for sure. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cannabis, to all intents and purposes, has no LD50. It was pretty much functionally or practically impossible to do that kind of harm to yourself. As the great country singer Willie Nelson once said, that I'm paraphrasing, the only way you could ever die from cannabis is if a heavy bale of it fell off a truck and crushed you. So it's an extremely safe plant that is very simpatico with the human organism in that regard. Okay. Now there's been some fascinating research on what's going on, with all the brain imaging stuff that they're able to do now, with psychedelics like psilocybin, for example. And I find that stuff really exciting. One of the presenters at our conference a couple of years ago was a scientist who's working in that area, neuroscience. She's a neuroscientist, and she threw up pictures on the screen on her PowerPoint of the brain with colored lines showing the connections between different parts of the brain, and she'd have like one image, of the quote normal or sober brain, and beside it is the same brain under the influence of psilocybin, and there are all these connections happening to different parts of the brain that weren't there before. These substances, like psilocybin, they're called tryptamine hallucinogens, and hallucinogens is not an appropriate word, by the way, but we could talk about that at another time. Excuse me. Because hallucination is considered a pathological experience that's not real, right? Anyway, substances, the chemical configuration of psilocybin matches brain chemistry very closely. The most powerful psychedelic on the planet, some people would maybe say another one is slightly more so, that's 5-MeO-DMT, but DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, is considered the most powerful psychedelic on the planet. We have it in our brain chemistry. It exists in the pineal gland. I believe it's pronounced pineal, P-I-N-E-A-L.
Yes, right.
And Dr. Rick Strassman wrote a book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, where he speculated, not claiming, for sure, but saying that it's very possible that an increase of DMT in the pineal gland released into one of the two brain hemispheres is responsible for experiences of mystical awakening, like Satori or whatever you want to call it. So these substances like psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, peyote, they're very simpatico with brain chemistry. They don't leave you, like, for example, datura is not in that category. Datura can leave you rubber-kneed for days on end. I've been told,
my goodness.
Oh, yeah. And many pharmaceutical drugs are not really, in that sense, simpatico with brain chemistry in that natural way. So in terms of this person's question, these plants are not really that foreign to our brains, I would say, overall. They're safe. It's rare that there would ever be, you'd have to take a boatload of peyote to. I mean, you could certainly be throwing up like crazy if you take a lot of it, if you're not used to it. Ayahuasca may have an LD50 at some point, but it's far, far beyond the amount that anyone could handle, emotionally or whatever you want to call that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all fascinating, and it's so interesting that all of this is coming to the forefront now, as we're moving towards, let's hope, a more enlightened planet. But also, let's talk a little bit about the fact that cannabis has been identified as a feminine aspect, as a feminine spirit. And I think that's so interesting, and you brought it up. It's mentioned a few places in the book, and I think it is a metaphor also in the way that the feminine spirit has been restricted. It has been treated in a way that it needs to be controlled. And certainly cannabis has been treated that way up until recently in the United States. It's not in other places. But there is something going on here where now cannabis is becoming more available. You're teaching people how to perceive it as a sacrament, as a spiritual ally, and that's a very different perspective than what we've been taught about cannabis being such a horrible plant, being such a dangerous thing. So we're getting out of that whole mindset. But I just love the fact that this is a feminine spirit ally. I think it's very, very interesting. And does that mean also, Stephen, that it would, as you set your intent for spiritual awakening, it's also going to help you awaken that feminine principle within yourself?
Yeah, I would say so. I just, if I may, just interject real briefly a comment that might be useful for people to understand the concept of drug, because it's such a bandied about word. I really like the way Terence McKenna talked about that. He said, a drug is anything that promotes unexamined habitual behavior. So that can be just about anything. It can be television, masturbating, workaholism, video game playing, or a substance of any kind. And cannabis can also be used in that way as well. So, right. But these psychedelics, these entheogenic substances, entheogen, by the way, means generating the divine within, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of people prefer that term now to psychedelic, although that's a good word too. It just means mind manifesting or soul manifesting. I just want to say that that's an important way to think about these substances, is that to think of them as spiritual allies if used properly rather than drugs. And then and not just cannabis in regard to your question, but I talked earlier in our conversation about the softening effect. It's like, oh boy, how to talk about this briefly. Here's one. This is just a way of looking at things. Okay, you might say that we're all children of God, and that in a sense, we came to this planet with that potential, but that both in our individual lives, but also over the course of history, the species became increasingly cut off from our true unconditioned nature, and more identified with the conditional ego that's always thinking of its own survival and all this kind of thing. So survival becomes the dominant way of dealing with life, and that leads to hierarchies and power fights and all that. So it becomes about power. And men had the power for one reason, because they were bigger and stronger, right? And they weren't tied down by the childbirth element of things in the same way that women were. So for whatever reason, men came to dominate most cultures, but not all, which is an interesting point in itself. There are matrilineal and matriarchal cultures as well. And there are partnership cultures where there's been great respect for women in that regard, and where things just take their natural place. It makes sense that a woman would be around the hearth more, because she's the one connected to the children. She can breastfeed them when they're young, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, but in this power dynamic thing, I mentioned earlier talking about the nature of spiritual awakening. So the opposite of spiritual awakening, in a sense, is ego, which is this, tight package of survival and the stories that we tell ourselves and all that. And there's a lot to do with power in all that. And so men have managed to, have that power historically for the most part, and it involves a tightening and a restricting and a toughening, in a sense, right? And closing off energies, closing off of our connection to spirituality. So those qualities have been associated more with women and with the feminine principle altogether. So again, what cannabis can do when you are able to channel that energy is release that tight bounded quality and open us up to the more heartfelt, in a sense, nurturing. It's like you could nurture the planet almost, and feel our hearts, not afraid to be vulnerable, not afraid to be emotional. Isn't it interesting how women cry far more easily than men? Why is that?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
and it's okay. I mean, very few people are going to feel that there's a problem if a woman cries, but a lot of men feel they can't, or they might feel that other men around them crying are weak, right?
That's it. Yes.
Yeah. So so the feminizing, I think, aspect is that there have been qualities that are natural to all human beings that have been repressed, and there's been a predominance toward this yang male kind of energies, in a sense, right? But they're the same energies that have cut us off from our relationship to spirit and to the world and to the planet altogether, and have led us to a crisis point in human history now, right? So what needs to happen, arguably, is that there needs to be a rebalancing of the energies of yin and yang, of male and female, and an allowing of that softness, that open-heartedness, that gentleness, that tenderness, that sensitivity, that connectedness, that women often have more than men because they've been allowed to, in a sense. Oh yeah, it's just that's a woman, yeah, you know what I mean? She's going to be weak and emotional.
Absolutely. You're going to be weak and emotional as a man. You can face a lot of judgment, self-judgment, and other people's judgment.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this may give people an opportunity, as you mentioned, to balance both male and female within. And isn't that the big alchemical treatise that we're all facing? And
indeed,
some may never face it because they'll be stuck in a place of total ego. But the people who are looking for the spiritual awakening can definitely work responsibly with cannabis and have a good outcome. Now, one other thing that you and I talked about before is, because I've heard this complaint, I'm a dream therapist, and people have said, I'm using this for my pain or whatever, but when I do, I cannot remember my dreams. And so you had a good answer for that. Do you remember what you said?
I do. Yeah, I remember the conversation. Well, part of it is this, what we talked about earlier in the conversation, this notion of frequency of use being an important issue. Yes. There are other issues that, not to distract you from your question, but that if we have time, and I don't think we have much left now, but maybe that's why we need to do another one in a couple of months.
Exactly.
We never got into talking about issues like dosage and methods of intake, and those are important issues, and also ceremonial use and a few other things that we didn't get into. But in regard to sorry, I forgot. I lost it for a second.
You were talking about going back to your comment about not using it too frequently. If you use it too frequently, you're going to run into this problem possibly.
It's the dream. Yes, the dreams question. Sorry. Excuse me. And I haven't taken any cannabis, so I can't blame my short-term. I can't blame my short-term memory loss on that one. So all I know is anecdotal evidence that a lot of people say that when they smoke cannabis daily, they don't dream. So if you're having to use it for medicinal benefit, then you're just going to have to live with that, I guess, for the most part, because you may need to use it daily. Use cannabis daily. If you don't need to use it daily and you would like to understand and practice how to use it as a spiritual ally or spiritual medicine. Again, a number of people, such as some of the contributors to the book, say that less frequently is going to be more effective. One of the contributors to the book, Mariano da Silva, is both an ayahuasca shaman and a cannabis shaman or expert on it as a spiritual medicine, and he said that he tries to keep it down to like once a week, leave 5, 6, 7 days between times, and then it's going to be sharper and deeper when you channel that energy, and then you bring some kind of meditative focus into it as much as possible. Yeah, I would guess that if you are able to limit your frequency of use to sort of every 4, 5, 6 days, 7 days, then you're more likely to have the dreams come back. In our conversation about that, I mentioned this substance that somebody gave me recently. It's happened to be sitting here. I've been using it, actually.
Dreams tea.
Yeah, it's called Dreams Tea, and it has damiana, mugwort, blue and pink lotus, passion flower, lavender, and spearmint in it. I've now taken it.
Delicious.
I've now had a cup of this stuff about an hour before bedtime 4 times. I've only had it for about a week and a half, and 3 of the 4 times I definitely had more powerful, meaningful, livelier, more visual dreams than I've been having in recent years. So maybe there are certain kinds of herbs that people can take that might counteract that effect.
I think that's terrific advice. I mean, it's something to definitely explore, don't you think, PK? That would be great.
Definitely. And I was also thinking about the fact that you're talking about the sensitivity and how it brings us out with everybody. We are in a universal 2-year which deals with sensitivity. So people involved with the cannabis are taking it. Will they find it they may need less of it this year because the year itself makes them more sensitive? So the intake may be more potent?
Well, that's an interesting question about dosage. Then give me an excuse to talk about that for a minute. Yes. One of the themes that comes up in the book repeatedly from different contributors is this notion that less is more. And now, less isn't always more, and sometimes more is more too. But it's not about getting blasted. It's not about escaping in any way, and it's not necessarily about creating some sort of sensational experience. It's about, and Joan Bellow talks about this really well in her chapter, it's about retraining ourselves over time, because of course the experience fades in a couple of hours, right? You might have this beautiful experience, but you're back to base camp 2 hours later or whatever. So it's really about recognizing that space, having these experiences occasionally, relaxing into it, and recognizing that our natural way is to trust the free-flowing movement of energy, so to speak. As I understand it, that's what the Tao, T-A-W, the Tao means. It's sometimes called the watercourse way, like the way water will always find the most effortless, effective way to make its way down a mountain. That's a kind of a metaphor for how we can function by trusting our own unconditioned intelligence in the moment, and that requires us to get out of our heads to a large degree and just relax into it. But in terms of this notion of less is more, you don't have to have a lot of cannabis to do that, and especially if you're dealing with the way we're dealing with these super strong medicines, these cannabis medicines these days. A very light dose is a good place to start, especially if you want to find out how much you can stay relaxed and present with, because the higher the dosage, the more the ego is potentially threatened, and the more your ego is going to kick up the dust, as it were, and try to prevent that from happening. So your mind can get really busy. You can have physical symptoms like dizziness, nausea, etc. You can have panic attacks. Paranoia can be associated with that. All those things are related to our ego being threatened in a sense, but that's where our path lies too. So, dosage, start with a very small dosage, especially if you're not familiar with it. And again, if you're doing it every day, it's different because there's a tolerance effect. But if you're doing it in these kinds of ways, perhaps, once every 4 days or once a week or even less often, then start with a very small dose. Try to be present with it. See if you can relax out of your head to some degree, and then maybe try to up the dosage. in that regard. So thanks for allowing me to segue into that one, PK.
No, it's a very important question that needed to be answered, and I'm glad PK asked you that question and you were able to bring it to this, because that is always a very important question that has to be answered. How much do you take? And also, then you can go further with what kind of method do you use, because there's so many methods of administering this, whether it's a chocolate candy bar, a lozenge, a suppository. I mean, they have all different kinds now.
Yeah,
So it's like, how do you decide? But I guess, again, everybody's different. You need to use what you're comfortable with. But I love your advice, Stephen, to be cautious and to start small. And it's also, I would imagine, a lot less expensive to start.
Definitely, yes. And also in regard to what PK was saying about, maybe the veils are thinner this year is one way of putting it, perhaps. I think that could be true as well, and fit into this less is more notion. Because ultimately, what Buddhist and other great traditions would say is the awakened state is our natural state. We don't necessarily have to have, substances to help us that regard. It's just that they do tend to open channels up that had been shut down. But the more you pay attention, in fact, with ayahuasca, the ayahuasqueros, the shamans that have been using this substance for many, many years, say many of them have gotten to the point where they hardly need any of it to have a really powerful experience. And in fact, let me just finish off by saying this: if you there's indigenous people often have this notion that a plant can become medicine for you, and what they mean, as I understand it, is that when you've developed a relationship with that plant, and I think ultimately the spirit of that plant, or what Kat Harrison would call the mother of that plant, then you actually have a relationship with the plant that doesn't necessarily require you to take it, to smoke it or eat it. In the Native American church ceremonies, they sometimes couldn't get the medicine. They have one peyote plant called the chief peyote, and occasionally they would have to just pass it around, and everyone would have a very powerful experience sometimes. And I can see that we need to quit now, right?
Yeah, unfortunately we do. But Stephen, we're going to have you back, because again, you have so much great information for everybody. A wonderful book that everybody should definitely get on Amazon.com or your local bookstore, Cannabis and Spirituality. And that is by Stephen Gray, who's been a wonderful guest tonight. Next week, we're back to aliens. And what are they doing? They are stealing souls. We're going to be talking with someone from the UK who has all the scoop on this.